Oh, good. The babysitter's here. The words hit me like ice water. As I walked into the wedding reception, my 7-year-old son's hand tight in mine. Every head at the head table turned toward us, and my sister Emma's laugh rang out across the room. Sharp, deliberate, meant to be heard. My name is Sarah. And I used to be Emma's big sister. Used to be the one she ran to when she scraped her knees, when boys broke her heart, when she needed someone to believe in her dreams of becoming a photographer. I used to be the golden child. Valedictorian. Full scholarship to Northwestern, the one mom and dad bragged about at dinner parties. That was before I got pregnant at 22 during my senior year of college. Before the father, a teaching assistant I thought I loved, disappeared the moment I told him. Before I had to drop out 3 months before graduation to work double shifts at a diner, my belly growing rounder as my dreams grew smaller. Emma was 18 then, just starting her freshman year at the same university I'd had to leave. While I was learning to change diapers with shaking hands and survive on 3 hours of sleep, she was pledging sororities and dating the quarterback. While I was clipping coupons and shopping at thrift stores, she was studying abroad in Italy, sending home pictures of herself laughing in cafes and kissing boys against ancient stone walls. The family narrative shifted so gradually I barely noticed it happening. Suddenly, Emma was the responsible one. Emma was the one with her head on straight. Emma was the daughter we can count on. And I became the cautionary tale, the whispered example of how quickly a life could derail. When Emma graduated with honors, with a job lined up, with a boyfriend who looked at her like she hung the moon, I was there in the audience, clapping until my hands were raw. My son Marcus was 4 then, squirming in his clip-on tie, asking loudly why Aunt Emma got to wear a funny hat. I shushed him, proud despite everything, despite the way my parents introduced me to their friends as our other daughter with a sad smile that said everything about how far I'd fallen from grace. Emma's photography career took off like a rocket. Gallery showings, magazine spreads, a coffee table book that made the bestseller list. She moved to New York, then LA, then back to Chicago into a loft that cost more than I made in 2 years. Her Instagram was a carefully curated dream: rooftop parties, exotic vacations, designer clothes, and eventually David, a tech entrepreneur who proposed on a beach in Santorini with a ring that could pay off my student loans 3 times over. Meanwhile, I was still in our hometown, still working at the diner that had become a restaurant, then a small chain. I'd worked my way up to manager, then regional supervisor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, honest work. I'd bought a small house with a backyard where Marcus could play. I'd finished my degree online, 1 class at a time, over 6 years of night school while he slept. But none of that mattered at family gatherings. I was still the daughter who'd thrown her life away, still the one who brought grocery store wine to dinner parties where everyone else discussed their latest business acquisitions, still the one whose achievements were met with patronizing smiles and comments like, "Well, you're doing the best you can." Emma tried to include me in her way. She'd send expensive gifts for Marcus's birthdays, toys he was too young for, clothes he'd outgrow before wearing. She'd call on major holidays, bright and chatty, telling me about her latest client, or trip while I folded laundry and stirred pasta sauce. She meant well, I told myself. She was busy. Important people needed her. The wedding planning had been a year-long exercise in feeling small. Every decision was filtered through what would photograph well, what would impress her clients, what would look good in the lifestyle magazines that wanted to feature her dream wedding. When she asked me to be her maid of honor, I was genuinely surprised and touched. For a moment it felt like being sisters again. But then came the dress fittings where the other bridesmaids, all successful career women, all childless, all effortlessly thin, made polite conversation about juice cleanses and weekend getaways, while I silently calculated whether I could afford the shoes that really completed the look. There were the planning meetings scheduled during Marcus's school hours, as if my availability as a single mother was infinitely flexible. There was the bachelorette party in Napa, that cost more than my monthly rent, which I'd attended for one awkward night before flying home to relieve the babysitter I couldn't really afford. Through it all, I smiled. I showed up. I played my role as the supportive big sister because I loved Emma, and because some part of me still hoped that being there for her biggest day might earn me back a place in the family narrative that wasn't defined by my mistakes. I should have known better. Marcus has been my anchor since the day he was born, 7 pounds, 3 ounces of wrinkled determination, who looked at me with dark eyes that seemed to say, "Well, Mom, what now?" He's the reason I got up at 5 a.m. to study for my online classes before my shift. He's why I learned to make Halloween costumes from scratch and birthday cakes from YouTube tutorials. He's why I never gave up, even when the weight of everything felt too heavy to carry. At 7, he's all curiosity and kindness, the type of kid who asks the grocery store clerk how her day is going, and actually listens to the answer. He has his father's dark hair, and my stubborn chin, but his heart is entirely his own, open, generous, unafraid to love people even when they don't love him back the way he deserves. He was so excited about Aunt Emma's wedding. He'd been practicing his ring-bearer walk for weeks, marching solemnly through our small living room with my old jewelry box balanced on a pillow. "I have to be very careful, Mom," he'd told me seriously. "This is the most important job I've ever had." I'd helped him pick out his suit, a miniature version of what the groomsmen were wearing, complete with a bow tie he'd learned to tie himself after watching 15 YouTube videos. He'd stood in front of my bedroom mirror that morning, smoothing down his cowlick and asking if I thought Aunt Emma would be proud of him. "She'll be so proud," I'd promised, kneeling to fix his boutonniere for the 3rd time. "You're going to be perfect." He'd hugged me then, his thin arms wrapping around my neck with the fierce intensity only children can manage. "You're going to be perfect too, Mom. You're the prettiest maid of honor ever." I'd held him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and trying not to cry on his suit jacket. He believed in me the way I'd once believed in Emma, with the kind of unquestioning faith that made you want to be worthy of it. As we walked into that reception hall, his hand in mine, I could feel his excitement radiating through his small fingers. He was looking around with wide eyes, taking in the fairy lights and flower arrangements, the elegant table settings, and the photographer capturing every perfect moment. "Wow, Mom," he whispered. "It's like a castle." And then my sister's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. "Oh good, the babysitter's here." I felt Marcus's hand tighten in mine, felt him look up at me with confusion flickering across his features. He was 7, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that word wasn't meant kindly, knew from the ripple of laughter that followed that we were the punchline to a joke he didn't understand. "Mom," he whispered, tugging on my hand, "why did Aunt Emma call you that?" I squeezed his fingers gently, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "It's okay, sweetheart. Let's go find our table." But it wasn't okay, and the look in his eyes confused, protective, already learning that the world could be cruel to the people he loved broke something in my chest that I'd been holding together with determination and willpower. My son deserved better than this. He deserved better than watching his mother be diminished and dismissed by people who were supposed to love her. He deserved to see me stand up for myself, to see me claim my worth instead of always swallowing it down with a smile. I just didn't know yet that he was about to show me how. The years after Marcus was born weren't just hard. They were a masterclass in learning to survive on scraps of sleep, hope, and grocery store coupons. While Emma was discovering herself in college parties and study abroad programs, I was discovering a strength I never knew I possessed. Those first months were brutal. Marcus was colicky, crying for hours despite my desperate attempts at soothing. I'd walk the floors of our tiny studio apartment at 3 a.m., bouncing him against my shoulder while tears of exhaustion streamed down my face. My body ached from the physical demands of new motherhood, but my heart ached more from the isolation. Friends from college had scattered to their new lives, and the few who stayed in touch seemed uncomfortable with my new reality. Playdates were replaced by study sessions. Late-night coffee runs with friends became late-night feedings with a baby who seemed determined never to sleep. The diner job was a godsend, and a nightmare rolled into one. The owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a mother of 4 who took pity on me and let me bring Marcus to work during slow afternoon shift. He'd sleep in a carrier while I refilled coffee and took orders, learning to nap through the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the coffee machine. Customers often cooed over him, slipping me extra tips with knowing smiles. But there were others who frowned at the sight of a baby in a restaurant, as if my need to work and parent simultaneously was somehow unseemly. The tips were everything. I learned to smile brighter when I was running on 2 hours of sleep, to remember regulars' orders and ask about their families even when my own world felt like it was held together with duct tape and prayer. A good day meant Marcus and I could afford both diapers and groceries. A bad day meant choosing between them and hoping tomorrow would be better. Nights were for studying. After putting Marcus to bed, I'd sit at our second-hand kitchen table with textbooks from the library and a laptop that took 5 minutes to boot up. I started with community college classes, basic requirements I could transfer later, affordable courses that fit around my work schedule, math at 11 p.m. after an 8-hour shift, history essays written in the margins of time between Marcus's bedtime and my own collapse into exhaustion. The first semester I failed 2 classes. The second, I passed everything with C's that felt like victories. By the third, I was making the dean's list while my son learned to walk around our coffee table and babble his first words to the rhythm of my type. Moving from the studio to a 1-bedroom felt like a major life achievement. Marcus got his own room, barely bigger than a closet, but I painted it blue with clouds on the ceiling, staying up until 3 a.m. with a brush I'd bought at the dollar store. He was 2 then, old enough to help by making handprints on the walls that I told him were birds flying through his sky. The promotion to shift supervisor came with a small raise and a lot more responsibility. I learned to schedule staff, manage inventory, handle difficult customers with the kind of diplomatic grace I'd never known I possessed. Miss Rodriguez became more than a boss, she became a mentor, teaching me about business management and small business ownership while watching Marcus color at the corner table during my administrative hours. "You've got a head for this," she told me one afternoon, as I presented her with a detailed analysis of our customer patterns and suggestions for improving efficiency. "You should think about management training, maybe running your own place someday." The idea seemed impossible then. I was just trying to make it through each day, to give Marcus a stable home and maybe someday finish my degree. But Mrs. Rodriguez saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself yet. A competence born from necessity. A leadership style forged in the fire of doing whatever it took to survive. When Marcus started kindergarten, it felt like both freedom and terror. Freedom because I could finally take morning classes and work more consistent hours. Terror because he was out in the world without me, navigating playgrounds and classrooms where I couldn't protect him from the small cruelties children sometimes inflict on those who are different. His teacher, Ms. Patterson, called me in for a conference after the first month. I prepared myself for the worst behavioral problems, academic struggles, the kind of issues that mark a child as coming from a broken home. Instead, she wanted to tell me what an exceptional child I was raising. "Marcus is one of the most empathetic children I've ever taught," she said, showing me drawings he'd made of our family, stick figures of the 2 of us with enormous smiles and hearts floating around our head. "He's always the first to help when someone is struggling, the first to include a child who's sitting alone. You're doing something very right." I cried in my car for 10 minutes after that conference, overwhelmed by the relief of knowing that despite everything, despite the chaos and uncertainty and constant financial stress, I was raising a good human being. The bachelor's degree took 6 years to complete, 6 years of online classes and night school, of studying for finals while Marcus did his homework beside me, of celebrating each small milestone with pizza from the dollar menu and high fives that meant more than any graduation ceremony ever. When I finally walked across that stage, Marcus in the audience cheering loud enough for everyone to hear, I wasn't the same person who'd left Northwestern pregnant and ashamed. I was stronger, tough. I'd learned to find joy in small victories and strength in seemingly impossible circumstances. I'd built a life for my son and myself from scratch, without help, without handouts, without anyone believing it was possible except the 2 of us. But somehow none of that mattered when I walked into family gatherings. Somehow I was still just the daughter who'd gotten pregnant, the sister who'd thrown her life away, the cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties. My degree was from a state school, not Northwest. My job was just restaurant management, not a glamorous career. My achievements were met with polite smiles and comments about doing the best I could under the circumstances. Emma's success felt like a rebuke to everything I'd worked for. Every magazine feature, every gallery opening, every Instagram post from some exotic location was a reminder of the life I'd given up when I chose to keep Mark. I tried not to be bitter. I loved my son more than I'd ever loved anything, and I wouldn't trade him for all the career success in the world. But there were moments, usually late at night when I was paying bills or lying awake worrying about his future, when I wondered what it would have been like to be the daughter who made everyone proud instead of the one who made everyone sad. The wedding planning had been a year-long reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. Every conversation about Emma's perfect dress, perfect venue, perfect photographer friends, felt like a subtle dig at my imperfect life. When she asked me to be her maid of honor, I was genuinely moved. until I realized it wasn't an honor so much as an expectation. Of course, the unsuccessful sister would drop everything to help the successful one have her perfect day. I'd thrown myself into the role anyway, because that's what I did. I showed up, I helped, I smiled and swallowed my own feelings, and tried to be the sister Emma needed me to be, even when it cost me more than I could afford and reminded me constantly of everything I was. But walking into that reception with Marcus's hand in mine, hearing my sister's voice ring out across the room with that cruel laugh, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't the same person who used to absorb everyone's disappointment and make it my own. I'd spent 7 years learning to be strong, learning to fight for what mattered, learning to protect the people I loved, and nobody, not even my sister, was going to humiliate my son. The reception hall was everything Emma had dreamed of, a study in elegant perfection that would photograph beautifully for the lifestyle magazines already lining up to feature her dream wedding. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece a masterpiece of white peonies and baby's breath that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The head table sat elevated on a small platform, like a stage where the wedding party could be admired and photographed from every angle. As Marcus and I made our way through the crowd, I could feel the familiar weight of being watched, evaluated, found wanted. It was the same feeling I'd carried through years of family gatherings, the sense that I was performing a role in someone else's story, that my presence was tolerated rather than welcome. Emma looked radiant at the head table, her designer gown arranged perfectly around her chair, her new husband David beaming beside her with the satisfied smile of a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. The other bridesmaids flanked her like beautiful accessories, their champagne flutes raised in an endless toast to perfection. Sarah, my mother's voice carried across the room, bright with the forced cheerfulness she used when she wanted to smooth over awkward moments. There you are. We were wondering where you'd gotten to. As if I hadn't been at the ceremony, as if I hadn't walked down that aisle in my bridesmaid dress, hadn't held Emma's bouquet during the vows, hadn't smiled for every photograph with the rest of the wedding party. As if the moment the formal obligations ended, I'd simply ceased to exist until they needed me again. Sorry, I said automatically, the word slipping out before I could stop it. Marcus needed to use the restroom, and then we got turned around looking for... Oh, the babysitter's here. Emma's voice cut through my explanation like a knife through silk. Her laugh followed, bright and sharp, designed to carry across the room, and ensure everyone heard. Now we can finally get this party started. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt Marcus's hand tighten in mine, felt him look up at me with those dark eyes full of confusion and hurt. Around us, conversations paused as people turned to look, some laughing along with Emma's joke, others looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. The babysitter, as if my presence here wasn't as Emma's sister, as her maid of honor, as someone who'd helped plan this entire event, as if I was just hired help, a convenience to watch the children so the real guests could enjoy themselves. I tried to force a smile, tried to play along with the joke the way I always did, the way I'd been trained to do through years of being the family disappointment, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the weight of Marcus's hand in mine, the knowledge that he was watching this interaction and learning from it. Maybe it was the accumulation of 7 years' worth of small humiliations and casual dismissal. Maybe it was simply that I'd worked too hard and come too far to let anyone, even my sister, make me feel small. Actually, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I'm here as your maid of honor, remember? Emma's laugh didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe, that I'd responded at all instead of just absorbing the hit with my usual gracious silence. Of course you are, she said, raising her champagne glass in a toast that felt more like a challenge. The maid of honor who's also conveniently available for childcare duties. How efficient. More laughter from the head table. David was grinning like this was all terrifically amusing. The other bridesmaids were exchanging glances that ranged from second-hand embarrassment to cruel delight. My parents were smiling those strained smiles they wore when they wanted everyone to know they were good sports about their daughter's situation. I could feel the familiar heat creeping up my neck, the flush of shame and anger that I'd learned to swallow down over the years. This was how it always went. Emma would make a cutting comment disguised as a joke. Everyone would laugh and I would smile along and pretend it didn't hurt because that was my role in the family dynamic. The good sport, the one who could take a joke, the sister who understood her place. But Marcus was 7 years old, and he was watching this happen to his mother. He was learning that this was how families treated each other, that this was normal,
that the people who were supposed to love you most were allowed to humiliate you for entertainment. Mom, he whispered, tugging on my hand, can we find our table now? I looked down at him, at his serious little face, at the way he was trying to protect me by creating an escape route, and something crystallized in my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the example I was setting for my son, about the lessons he was learning about how to treat people and how to let people treat him. Of course, sweetheart, I said, squeezing his hand. Let's go find where we're sitting. But as we walked away from the head table, I could still hear Emma's voice carrying across the room, still feel the weight of all those eyes following us, the familiar feeling of being the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong, the one whose presence was more obligation than joy. I'd spent so many years trying to earn my way back into the family's good graces, trying to prove that I wasn't the failure they thought I was, but walking away from that head table with my son's hand in mine, I realized something I should have understood years ago. I had nothing to prove to anyone. I'd built a good life for Marcus and myself. I'd worked hard, made sacrifices, overcome obstacles that would have broken a weaker person. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their acceptance. I didn't need to play the role of the grateful, self-deprecating sister who absorbed everyone's cruelty with a smile. What I needed was to show my son that he was worth fighting for, that we both were. I just didn't know yet that he was about to show me how to do exactly that. We found our assigned table tucked away in the back corner of the reception hall, far from the action and clearly designated for family with children, a polite way of saying we'd been relegated to the kids' table section where we wouldn't disturb the real celebration. Sitting with us were my cousin Jake's twin boys, who were Marcus's age and immediately launched into an animated discussion about Pokemon cards, and my elderly Aunt Ruth, who was slightly deaf and had been placed at our table presumably because she wouldn't mind the noise. Well, this is cozy, Aunt Ruth said loudly, surveying our exile with the sharp eyes of someone who'd been navigating family politics for 8 decades. Nothing says we love you like seating arrangements that scream out of sight, out of mind. I tried to make light conversation as the dinner service began, but I could feel the tension coiled in my shoulders, could sense Marcus glancing between me and the head table where Emma was holding court. The speeches began during the salad course, Emma's college roommate sharing a story about their adventures in Italy, David's best man making jokes about bachelor parties and ball and chains that made the older guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then David stood tapping his champagne flute with his knife to get everyone's attention. I'd like to say a few words about my beautiful bride, he began, his voice carrying easily across the room with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention in boardrooms and conference calls. The speech was everything you'd expect: polished, romantic, peppered with inside jokes that made Emma glow with happiness. David talked about falling in love with her talent, her ambition, her ability to see beauty in everything around her. He talked about their travels together, their shared dreams, their perfect partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals. Emma has always known exactly what she wanted, he said, raising his glass toward the head table. She's focused, driven, uncompromising in her pursuit of excellence. She never let anything derail her from her path, never let herself get distracted by temporary pleasures that could throw her whole future off course. The words seemed innocent enough on the surface, but I felt them like a slap. The emphasis on distracted, the pointed look in my direction, the implication that some people unlike his perfect bride had made choices that derailed their futures. It was subtle enough that most of the guests probably didn't catch it, but my parents did, judging by their sudden stillness. Emma did, judging by the way her smile grew sharper. That's what I love most about Emma, David continued, his voice growing more confident as he warmed to his theme. She's never been the type to get herself in situations that might compromise her dreams. She's always been smart about her choices, responsible about her future. She's never had to settle for less than she deserved. I felt the familiar burn of shame and anger mixing in my chest, but this time it was different. This time I wasn't alone in feeling it. Marcus had gone very still beside me, his 7-year-old brain processing the adult conversation with the frightening clarity children sometimes possessed. Mom, he whispered, loud enough that our table could hear, is he talking about you? The question cut through the polite applause following David's speech like a sword through silk. Several people at nearby tables turned to look at us, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment, not for me but for Marcus, who was too young to understand why his innocent question had made the adults around him uncomfortable. It's okay, sweetheart, I murmured, putting my arm around his shoulders. He's just giving a speech about Aunt Anne. But Marcus, wasn't satisfied with that explanation. At 7 he had a finely tuned sense of fairness and injustice, and something about the adult conversation was bothering him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "But why did he look at you when he said that stuff about getting distracted?" he asked, his voice carrying in the momentary lull between speeches. "And why did everyone look at us funny?" More heads turned our way. I could see Emma at the head table, her expression shifting from amusement to irritation that the attention was being pulled away from her perfect moment. My mother was making frantic quiet-down gestures in our direction, as if Marcus's questions were some kind of social emergency that needed to be contained. "Marcus, honey, let's just listen to the speeches," I said quietly, trying to smooth over the moment the way I always did, the way I'd been trained to do. "Keep quiet, don't make waves, don't ruin anyone else's perfect day with your messy reality." But then Emma stood up, champagne flute in hand, and I realized the situation was about to get much worse. "Actually," she said, her voice bright with the kind of artificial cheer that made my stomach clench, "since we're talking about choices and responsibility, I think this is the perfect time to acknowledge someone very special, my big sister Sarah." She raised her glass in my direction, and I felt every eye in the room turn toward our corner table. This was it, the moment when Emma would make some gracious comment about how proud she was of how I'd overcome my challenges, or how I was doing the best I could under difficult circumstances. The patronizing kindness that was somehow worse than outright cruelty because it came wrapped in fake love. "Sarah's been such an inspiration to all of us," Emma continued, her voice carrying across the silent room. "She's shown us all what happens when you let one mistake define your entire life, when you give up on your dreams because things get a little complicated." The words hit me like physical blows around the room. I could hear the sharp intake of breath from guests who were uncomfortable with the direction this was taking, but no one said anything, no one stood up, no one told Emma to stop. "She's taught us all about the importance of making smart choices," Emma went on, her smile bright and cruel, "about thinking before you act, about not letting temporary pleasures ruin your permanent future. She's been a wonderful cautionary tale for our whole family." The silence that followed was deafening. I sat frozen in my chair, every nerve ending on fire with humiliation and rage. This wasn't just cruelty, this was a public execution, delivered with a smile and a champagne toast at what was supposed to be a celebration of love and family. But then something extraordinary happened. Marcus stood up.
My 7-year-old son, barely tall enough to see over the floral centerpiece, pushed back his chair and stood up in that room full of adults. His little face was flushed with an emotion I'd never seen there before. Not just anger, but righteous indignation, the fury of someone watching an injustice being committed against a person he loved. "That's not true," he said, his young voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "That's not true about my mom." Emma's smile faltered. David looked confused. The entire reception hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus looked directly at Emma, his small chin raised with a determination that made my heart break and swell at the same time. "My mom didn't make a mistake," he said, his voice shaking but steady. "She made me, and I'm not a mistake." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of people witnessing cruelty. This was the electric silence of a moment when everything changes, when truth cuts through pretense like lightning through darkness. And then my son did something that would be talked about for years, something that would go viral when someone's cell phone video hit social media, something that would reshape the entire trajectory of our family's story. He walked over to the microphone. The microphone stood abandoned after David's speech, cords snaking across the floor like a challenge waiting to be accepted. Marcus walked toward it with the determined gait of someone who had something important to say and wasn't going to be stopped by anyone. Not by the shocked guests. Not by my whispered "Marcus, sweetie, come back," not by the growing murmur of confusion rippling through the reception hall. He was too short to reach the microphone at its current height, so he dragged a chair over with the scraping sound of metal against marble that made everyone wince. The noise seemed to snap the room out of its frozen shock. I could see Emma starting to rise from her seat at the head table, could see David reaching for the microphone cord, as if he could somehow stop what was about to happen. But Marcus was 7 years old and fueled by the kind of righteous anger that only children can feel when they see someone they love being hurt. He climbed onto that chair, adjusted the microphone with the careful precision he'd learned from watching Emma's photographer friends set up their equipment, and looked out at a room full of adults who had just watched his mother be humiliated for their entertainment. "Hi," he said, his young voice amplified across the suddenly silent reception hall. "My name is Marcus, and that lady who just said mean things is my Aunt Emma, and this is her wedding, and that's my mom over there who she was being mean to." He pointed directly at me sitting frozen at our corner table, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Around the room, cell phones were starting to come out because nothing says 2023 like a 7-year-old with a microphone going viral at a wedding reception. "I want to tell you guys about my mom," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "because I don't think you know her very well if you think she made a mistake by having me." Emma was fully standing now, gesturing frantically at the DJ to cut the sound system, but the DJ, a young guy who probably had younger siblings of his own, seemed frozen by the sheer audacity of what was unfolding. "This wasn't in any wedding planning handbook. My mom works really, really hard," Marcus said, warming to his theme with the fearless honesty that made him such an extraordinary kid. "She gets up really early to make me breakfast, and then she goes to work and manages a whole restaurant, and then she comes home and helps me with my homework, and reads me stories and tucks me in every single night." I could feel tears starting to burn behind my eyes, but I couldn't look away from my son standing up there with his clip-on bow tie slightly askew, defending me with the fierce loyalty of someone who had never doubted my worth for a single second of his life. "She went to school at night after I went to bed so she could get her degree and make a better life for us," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "She never missed any of my school plays or soccer games, even when she was really tired. She taught me how to ride a bike and how to make pancakes, and how to be kind to people even when they're not kind to you." The room was so quiet I could hear the clink of ice in someone's water glass, could hear the soft whir of the photographer's camera, capturing every moment of this unscripted, unfiltered display of love. "She reads me stories every night, even when she's so tired she can barely keep her eyes open," Marcus said, his voice softening with memory. "And she always does the funny voices for all the characters, and she never gets mad when I ask her to read the same story over and over again." I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as I watched my son, my beautiful, brave, incredible son, stand up in front of all these people and speak the truth about our life together. Not the sanitized version that fit into other people's narratives about single mothers and mistakes, but the real truth about love and sacrifice, and the daily miracle of raising a child. "She makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches in the whole world," Marcus continued, and despite everything, I found myself smiling through my tears. "And she always cuts them into triangles, because she says food tastes better when it's cut into fun shapes. And when I have bad dreams, she lets me sleep in her bed, and she tells me stories about brave knights and dragons, until I fall asleep." Around the room, I could see people's expressions changing. The cruel amusement was gone, replaced by something softer, more human. These were parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, who recognized something universal in Marcus's words: the fierce love between a mother and child, the small daily acts of devotion that make up a life. "My mom didn't throw her life away," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger again as he looked directly at Emma. "She gave me life. She gave me everything good in my whole world, and if you think that's a mistake, then you don't know what love really means." The silence that followed was profound. Even Emma had stopped trying to reach the microphone, frozen by the simple, devastating truth that had just come from the mouth of a 7-year-old, who loved his mother with the kind of fierce, uncomplicated devotion that adults spend their whole lives trying to recapture. "She's not the babysitter," Marcus continued, his voice shaking slightly but never wavering. "She's my mom. She's your sister. She's the person who helped plan this whole party and made sure everything was perfect for you, even though—" He paused, seeming to realize he was venturing into territory that might be too adult for him to navigate, but then he straightened his shoulders and looked out at the room full of wedding guests, who were hanging on his every word. "Even though you guys don't always treat her very nice." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the room, I could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, could see the recognition dawning on faces, as they remembered their own moments of casual cruelty, their own participation in the family narrative that had diminished me for years. "My mom is the best person I know," Marcus said, his voice softening again as he looked directly at me. "She works harder than anybody, and she's never mean to people, and she always helps when someone needs help, and she makes me feel safe and loved every single day." He paused, wiping his nose with the back of his hand in a gesture so childlike and innocent that it made the profound truth of his words even more powerful. "So I just wanted you all to know that," he said simply, "because I don't think you, and I think my mom deserves for people to know how awesome she really is." And then he carefully stepped down from the chair, walked across the room under the eyes of every single wedding guest, and climbed into my lap, wrapping his thin arms around my neck with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had just gone to war for the person he loved most in the world. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, broken finally by an unexpected sound: applause. It started with Aunt Ruth, whose 8 decades of life had given her the wisdom to recognize authentic love when she saw it. Her gnarled hands came together in slow, deliberate claps that echoed across the room like a heartbeat. Then Jake's wife started clapping, tears streaming down her face, as she looked at her own twin boys with something like wonder, as if seeing for the first time the kind of fierce loyalty children were capable of when they truly felt loved and protected. The applause spread like wildfire. Guests who had been uncomfortable witnesses to Emma's cruelty suddenly found their voices, their hands, their humanity. They clapped for Marcus's courage, for his love, for the simple truth he had spoken in a room full of adults who had forgotten what truth sounded like. But most of all, they clapped for me, for the mother who had raised a child capable of such love, such bravery, such unwavering loyalty, for the woman who had worked 3 jobs, and gone to night school and sacrificed everything to give her son the kind of childhood that produced this moment of pure, uncomplicated devotion. I held Marcus close, my tears falling into his dark hair as the applause washed over us like absolution. 7 years of shame and self-doubt and quiet desperation seemed to lift from my shoulders with each clap, each smile, each nod of recognition from people who were finally seeing me as I really was, not a cautionary tale or a family disappointment, but a mother who had done the impossible and done it well. When I looked up through my tears, I could see Emma still standing at the head table, her face pale with shock and something that might have been recognition. David was beside her, looking like a man who had just realized he'd badly miscalculated the room. My parents were clapping too, but their faces were complex maps of emotions I couldn't begin to decipher. Pride and shame and regret all tangled together in expressions that would haunt me for weeks to come. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Not Emma's cruelty, not David's condescension, not years of family dynamics that had made me feel small and worthless. What mattered was the weight of my son in my arms, the sound of genuine appreciation from people who had just witnessed something real and beautiful and true. What mattered was that Marcus had shown me something I'd forgotten. I was worth fighting for. We both were. The applause eventually died down, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. What had been a polished, picture-perfect reception was now charged with the kind of raw emotion that no wedding planner could anticipate or control. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, quieter, more thoughtful, punctuated by glances in our direction that carried something new: respect. Emma remained standing at the head table for a long moment, her hands gripping the back of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. The photographer, sensing that the scripted portion of the evening was over, had put down his camera and was checking his phone with the uncomfortable air of someone who wanted to be anywhere else. David was the first to break. He walked over to the DJ booth and said something that made the young man nod vigorously before switching on background music, generic reception jazz that felt jarringly normal after what had just happened. Then he returned to Emma and took her arm, whispering something in her ear that made her face crumple for just a moment before she caught herself and rebuilt her composure with visible effort. "I need some air," she announced to no one in particular, then walked quickly toward the French doors that led to the garden terrace, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor with staccato urgency. The wedding party seemed unsure what to do without their focal point. The other bridesmaids clustered together like confused sheep, occasionally glancing toward the terrace doors, and then back at the rest of us, as if waiting for someone to tell them how to react. The groomsmen made awkward conversation about sports and work, the kind of safe topics men retreat to when emotions get too complex to navigate. My parents approached our table with careful steps, as if they were walking through a minefield. My father's face wore the expression of a man who was doing complex moral calculations in real time, trying to figure out how to process what had just happened and what it meant for the family dynamics he'd helped create. "Sarah," my mother said softly, her voice carrying emotions I couldn't quite identify, "that was Marcus's." She trailed off, unable to find words that could encompass what she'd just witnessed. My father cleared his throat twice before managing to speak. "Your boy has quite a set of lungs on him," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been pride or regret, or both. "Quite a set of principles, too." Marcus looked up at his grandparents with the solemn expression he wore when adults were being particularly confused. "I just told the truth, Grandpa," he said simply. "Mom always says telling the truth is important, even when it's hard." The words hit my father like a physical blow. I watched his face cycle through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, shame, as he processed the implicit criticism in his grandson's innocent statement. When had any of us told the truth about the family dynamics that had made me feel so small for so many years? When had anyone stood up and said that the way I was being treated was wrong? "Yes," my father said quietly, kneeling down so he was at Marcus's eye level. "Your mother is right about that. Telling the truth is always important." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years: recognition. Not of who I'd failed to become, but of who I actually was. The daughter who had worked impossibly hard to build a good life for her son. The mother who had raised a child capable of such fierce love and moral clarity. The woman who had deserved better from her family all along. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think we need to have some conversations, some overdue conversation." Before I could respond, Jake appeared at our table with his twin boys in tow. His face was red with emotion, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with feeling. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, looking directly at Marcus. "You stood up for your mom like a real man, like a real son. I hope my boys learn to be half as loyal as you are." His twins nodded solemnly, clearly impressed by their slightly older cousin's display of courage. One of them, Tommy, tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "That was so cool," he whispered loudly. "You weren't scared at all." "I was scared," Marcus admitted, leaning closer to his cousin. "But sometimes you have to be brave even when you're scared. That's what Mom taught me." More guests approached our table throughout the evening, each with their own version of praise for Marcus's speech, and by extension for the mother who had raised him. Mrs. Patterson, who worked with my mother at the library, squeezed my hand and told me how proud I should be. David's uncle, a gruff man who ran a construction company, clapped me on the shoulder and said Marcus reminded him of his own son at that age: brave, and principled, and unafraid to speak truth to power. But the most unexpected visitor was David's mother, an elegant woman in her 60s, who had always been politely distant during family gatherings. She approached our table with measured steps, and expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah," she said formally, "I wanted to apologize for my son's speech earlier. His words were inappropriate, unkind, and inaccurate." She paused, looking down at Marcus with something like wonder. "Your son has more character in his little finger than most adults manage in a lifetime. You should be extraordinarily proud of the man you're raising." The words were formal, carefully chosen, but they carried the weight of genuine regret and recognition. David's mother was a woman who valued propriety above almost everything else, and for her to publicly acknowledge that her son had behaved badly was tantamount to a family revolution. "Thank you," I managed, my voice still hoarse from crying. "That means, thank you." She nodded once, squeezed my shoulder briefly, and walked away, leaving me to wonder what conversations were going to happen in David's family after tonight. Emma never came back inside. As the evening wound down, I learned from various sources that she was in the bridal suite, alternately crying and raging about how her perfect day had been ruined. David was with her, along with two of her bridesmaids, trying to calm her down and figure out how to salvage what was left of their reception. But the truth was, the reception continued without them. Guests danced and laughed and celebrated with the kind of genuine joy that had been missing from the carefully orchestrated perfection of the earlier evening. Children ran between tables, their laughter mixing with the music in a way that felt natural and right. Parents held their own kids a little tighter, maybe thinking about the fierce love Marcus had demonstrated, and wondering if they were worthy of such devotion. When it came time to leave, Marcus was exhausted but happy, slumped against my side in the passenger seat with his bow tie finally undone and his suit jacket wrinkled from an evening of being hugged by relatives and strangers alike. "Mom," he said, sleepily as I drove us home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood. "Yes, sweetheart. Did I do the right thing?" With the microphone and everything, I pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine, then twisted in my seat to look at my son, my brave,
beautiful, extraordinary son who had stood up for me when no one else would. You did exactly the right thing, I told him, reaching over to smooth his hair. You told the truth with love. You stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself. You showed everyone in that room what real courage looks like. He smiled sleepily, satisfied with my answer. I love you, Mom. I love you too, Marcus, more than you'll ever know. As I carried him inside and up to his bedroom, still in his wrinkled suit, I realized that something fundamental had changed tonight. Not just in how other people saw me, but in how I saw myself. For 7 years, I'd been carrying the weight of other people's disappointment, other people's judgment, other people's narrative about who I was and what my life meant. But Marcus had shown me something crucial. The only opinion that truly mattered was the one held by the person who knew me best, who loved me most, who had watched me fight and struggle and succeed every single day of his life. In his eyes, I wasn't a cautionary tale or a family disappointment. I was simply Mom, the person who read bedtime stories and made grilled cheese triangles and worked impossibly hard to give him everything he needed to grow up safe and loved and confident enough to stand up for what was right. That was enough. That was everything. The video went viral within hours. Someone I never found out who had recorded Marcus's entire speech on their phone and posted it to TikTok with the caption 7-year-old defends his mom at wedding reception. Loyal son, single mom strong. By Sunday morning, it had been viewed over 2 million times. By Monday it was featured on Good Morning America's Feel Good Monday segment. By Tuesday I was fielding calls from talk show producers, magazine editors, and documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell our story. The attention was overwhelming, and frankly terrifying. I'd spent 7 years trying to blend into the background, to not make waves, to avoid drawing attention to our unconventional family structure. Suddenly, strangers on the internet were dissecting every detail of our lives, calling Marcus a hero and me an inspiration, based on a 2-minute speech at a wedding reception. The comments on the original video were a mixed bag of humanity at its best and worst. Thousands of people shared their own stories of family rejection, of being judged for their choices, of children who had defended their parents against unfair criticism. Single mothers from around the world posted photos of themselves with their kids, using hashtags like Proud Mom Moment and Not a Mistake that made me cry every time I saw them. But there were cruel comments too, people questioning my parenting for putting my child in that situation, others speculating about Marcus's father, still others making assumptions about our finances, our lifestyle, our worthiness of the support we were receiving. I learned quickly to avoid reading the comments section entirely. The most surreal part was watching my family scramble to control the narrative. Emma deactivated her social media accounts entirely after several news outlets picked up the story and started reaching out to her for comment. My parents issued a carefully worded statement to our local newspaper about being proud of their grandson's character, while avoiding any mention of the family dynamics that had led to Marcus's speech in the first place. David's PR team, because of course he had a PR team, sent a formal apology through their lawyer acknowledging that his wedding speech had been poorly worded, and expressing regret for any misunderstanding it might have caused. The apology was so sanitized and corporate that it managed to make things worse, turning what could have been a genuine moment of accountability into another example of wealthy people using lawyers to avoid facing consequences for their actions. But along with the chaos and unwanted attention, came something I hadn't expected: opportunities. Mrs. Rodriguez called me the Monday after the wedding, her voice bright with excitement. "Sarah, you need to see the new Channel 7 wants to do a story about working mothers, and they specifically asked if they could interview you at the restaurant. They want to highlight how hard you've worked to build a career while raising Marcus." The news story led to an unexpected opportunity. A regional restaurant chain, that had been following my work for years, suddenly accelerated their timeline for expanding into our area, offering me a position as district manager with a salary that was nearly double what I was making. The job came with health insurance, a company car, and a benefits package that would finally give us the financial security I'd been working toward for years. "We've been impressed with your management style and your commitment to excellence," the regional director explained during our interview. "But what really convinced us was seeing how you've raised your son. The character he demonstrated reflects the kind of leadership qualities we value in our management team." I almost laughed at the irony. 7 years of hard work, night school, and professional development had earned me consideration for the position, but it was Marcus's 2-minute speech that sealed the deal. The offers kept coming. A publisher wanted me to write a book about single motherhood and resilience. A motivational speaking bureau reached out about sharing our story at conferences for working parents. A scholarship foundation offered Marcus a full ride to a prestigious private school, saying his demonstration of character and loyalty made him exactly the kind of student they wanted to support. I turned down most of the offers, but not all of them. The book contract was too good to pass up, especially when the advance was enough to put a significant down payment on a house in a better school district. The speaking engagements were selective, only events that felt authentic to our experience, only messages that I genuinely believed in. But the most meaningful support came from unexpected places. Mothers started reaching out directly, through social media and email addresses that somehow got leaked. Despite my best efforts to maintain privacy, they shared their own stories of judgment and redemption, of children who surprised them with their wisdom, of families who eventually learned to see past their disappointment to the love underneath. A single mother from Oregon sent a care package, filled with homemade cookies and a note that said, "From one mom who's doing her best to another, you're raising an amazing kid." A grandmother from Texas wrote a 5-page letter about watching her own daughter struggle with family acceptance after an unplanned pregnancy, and how Marcus's speech had inspired her to reach out and repair that relationship. The local community response was even more powerful. Parents at Marcus's school started inviting us to playdates and birthday parties with the kind of genuine warmth I hadn't experienced in years. Teachers who had always been professional but distant suddenly went out of their way to tell me what a remarkable child I was raising. Miss Patterson, Marcus's teacher, pulled me aside during pickup one afternoon about a month after the wedding. "I need you to know," she said quietly, "that what happened at that reception has changed how some of the other parents see single-parent families. 3 different mothers have come to me asking for advice on how to be more inclusive, how to avoid making assumptions." Marcus didn't just defend you that night, he educated an entire community. The ripple effects extended beyond our immediate circle. The video had been shared so widely that it started appearing in parenting forums, education websites, and social media groups dedicated to family dynamics. Child psychologists used it as an example of how children internalize their parents' values and will defend those they love when they feel safe enough to do so. Rebecca Martinez, a family therapist who specializes in single-parent households, wrote an entire blog post analyzing Marcus's speech. "This child felt secure enough in his mother's love to take a risk on her behalf," she wrote. "That level of emotional security doesn't happen by accident. It's the result of consistent, loving parenting that prioritizes the child's emotional well-being above social expectations." Reading those words, I finally understood something that had taken me 7 years to learn. I hadn't failed at anything. I had succeeded at the most important job in the world, raising a human being who was confident, compassionate, and brave enough to stand up for what was right. The house we bought 6 months later wasn't much, a 3-bedroom ranch in a neighborhood where kids played in the streets and parents gathered on front porches, but it was ours. Marcus had his own room with enough space for a desk and bookshelves, and I had a home office where I could write in the evenings after he went to bed. The book, when it was published, became a modest bestseller, not because our story was extraordinary but because it was so ordinary, the daily struggles and small victories of single parenthood, told without drama or self-pity. Just the truth about what it means to love a child so much that you'll do whatever it takes to give them a good life, even when the world tells you that your best isn't good enough. But the most important change wasn't the house or the job, or the book contract. It was the shift in how I saw myself and how I moved through the world. Marcus had shown me something profound that night at the wedding. I didn't need anyone's approval to know my own worth. I didn't need anyone's permission to take up space in the world. I was enough. I had always been enough. And finally, beautifully, I believed.
2 years after the wedding, on a quiet Saturday morning in our new house, Marcus and I were making pancakes together when he asked me the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Mom, do you ever think about my dad?" I paused in the middle of flipping a pancake, my heart doing that little skip it always did when this topic came up. We'd had age-appropriate conversations about his father before, how sometimes people aren't ready to be parents, how love doesn't always work out the way we hope it will, how our family was different, but no less complete because of it. But at 9 years old, Marcus's questions were getting more complex, more personal, more difficult to answer without revealing my own hurt. Sometimes I said honestly, setting down the spatula and turning to face him, "Do you think about him?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, concentrating on the task of setting our small kitchen table with the mismatched plates we'd bought at a yard sale. His hair was getting longer, and he had to push it out of his eyes as he worked, a gesture that reminded me so much of myself at his age, that it made my chest tight. Sometimes I wonder what he looks like, he said finally. If I look like him, if he's tall like me, or if he likes the same books I like. I nodded, understanding the curiosity that came with having a parent-shaped hole in your understanding of yourself. That's natural, sweetheart. It's okay to wonder about those things. But mostly, Marcus continued, arranging the forks with the careful precision he brought to everything he cared about. I feel sorry for him. The words caught me off guard. I'd expected anger, curiosity, maybe hurt, but not pity. Sorry for him? I asked gently. Marcus looked up at me with those dark eyes that had always seen more than they should have to. Yeah, because he missed out on knowing me, and on knowing you. He said it so matter-of-factly, with the simple confidence of a child who had never doubted his own worth or his mother's love. But the words hit me like a physical force, bringing tears to my eyes that I tried to blink away before he noticed. He doesn't know that you make the best pancakes in the world, Marcus continued, warming to his theme, or that you always remember to cut them into fun shape. He doesn't know that you never miss my soccer games, even when you have to work late. He doesn't know how you sing off-key in the car, but it makes me laugh anyway. I sat down at our little table, overwhelmed by the generosity of my son's heart, by his ability to see loss not as abandonment, but as something to be pitied rather than resented. He doesn't know that you help me with my homework even when you're really tired, Marcus said, settling into the chair across from me, or that you always check under my bed for monsters, even though I'm probably too old for that now. You're never too old for monster checks, I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. And he doesn't know about the microphone thing at Aunt Emma's wedding, Marcus said, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper he used when he was sharing something particularly important. He doesn't know that I have the bravest mom in the whole world. The tears came then, despite my best efforts to hold them back. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when your heart is so full it has nowhere else to go. Marcus reached across the table and patted my hand with the gentle concern of someone who had spent his whole life taking care of the person who took care of him. It's okay, Mom, he said seriously. I know you still feel sad about him sometimes, but I think our family is perfect exactly the way it is. And sitting there in our little kitchen, with pancakes getting cold on the stove and morning sunlight streaming through windows of a house we owned free and clear, with my son's small hand warm on mine, and his beautiful heart breaking mine open with love, I realized he was absolutely right. We were perfect exactly the way we were, not because we'd never faced hardship, or made mistakes, or struggled to fit into other people's definitions of what a family should look like, but because we had loved each other fiercely and without reservation through all of it. Because we had built something strong and beautiful and unshakable out of whatever materials we had at hand. Because when it mattered most, when the world tried to tell us we weren't enough, we had stood up for each other with the kind of courage that only comes from knowing you are unconditionally loved. You're right, I told my son, squeezing his hand gently. Our family is perfect exactly the way it is. And for the first time in my adult life, I meant it completely. Later that afternoon, as I was folding laundry in my bedroom, I heard Marcus on the phone with his friend Jake from school. They were making plans for a sleepover, and I smiled as I listened to him negotiate the details with the diplomatic skills he'd inherited from somewhere deeper than genetics. My mom makes really good pizza from scratch, I heard him say, and she always lets us stay up late to watch movies. Plus, she's really fun. All my friends think she's the coolest mom ever. The words were casual, thrown away in the midst of planning their weekend, but they hit me with the force of revelation. This was how my son saw me, not as a cautionary tale, or a family disappointment, but as the cool mom, the fun mom, the mom his friends wanted to spend time with. This was my legacy, not the mistakes I'd made or the dreams I'd had to adjust, but the human being I'd raised who moved through the world with confidence and kindness, who stood up for what was right, who loved without reservation and expected to be loved the same way in return. This was enough. This was everything. Outside, the late afternoon sun was painting our backyard golden, and I could see Marcus through the window, practicing soccer moves on the grass we'd planted together last spring. His form was getting better. He was tall for his age, with the kind of natural athleticism that suggested he'd inherited at least one useful gene from his absent father. But watching him out there, focused and determined and completely comfortable in his own skin, I realized that whatever he'd gotten from his father paled in comparison to what we'd built together. The confidence to stand up to a room full of adults, the security to love without fear, the unshakable knowledge that he was valued and cherished and worth fighting for. These were the gifts I'd given him, not through grand gestures or perfect parenting, but through the accumulation of small daily acts of love, through bedtime stories and triangle-cut sandwiches and never missing a school play, through working 3 jobs so he could have stability, through going to night school so he could have opportunities, through standing up to family members who tried to make him feel less than whole, through showing him, every single day, that he was not a mistake, that our family was not a consolation prize, that love was not diminished by being unconventional. As I watched him practice his footwork in the golden afternoon light, I realized that the story that had begun with shame and fear, and the crushing weight of other people's expectations had somehow transformed into something beautiful. Not perfect, we still struggled sometimes, still faced challenges, still had to work harder than families with more resources and more support, but beautiful in its authenticity, in its hard-won victories, in its absolute refusal to be defined by anyone else's limitation. That night, as I was tucking Marcus into bed in his room with the painted clouds on the ceiling, he looked up at me with that serious expression he wore when he was working through something complicated. "Mom?" he said softly. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Aunt Emma ever thinks about what I said at her wedding?" I considered the question carefully. Emma and I had spoken exactly twice since that night. Once when she called to yell at me for embarrassing her in front of her friends, and once when she sent a stiff formal apology 6 months later after our parents had apparently staged some kind of intervention. Both conversations had been brief and unsatisfying, full of the kind of careful politeness that indicated the fundamental issues between us remained unresolved. "I think she probably does," I said finally. "I think sometimes people need time to understand difficult truths." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I hope she does. I hope she remembers that families are supposed to be kind to each other." "Me too, sweetheart." "And Mom?" he said, his voice getting sleepy as I smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "I'm glad you're my mom. I wouldn't want any other mom in the whole world." I kissed his forehead, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the particular sweetness that belonged only to him. "I'm glad you're my son too. I wouldn't trade you for any." As I turned off his light and pulled his door almost closed, leaving just the crack of hallway light he still preferred, I realized that this was the real ending to our story. Not the viral video or the book deal, or the recognition from strangers, not even Emma's eventual apology or my family's belated acknowledgement of their mistake. The real ending was this: a mother and child who had built something unbreakable together, who had faced the world's judgment and emerged stronger, who had learned that the only validation that truly mattered was the kind they gave each other. The real ending was love, pure and simple, love that had grown stronger in the face of adversity, love that had transformed pain into purpose, love that had taught a 7-year-old boy that standing up for someone you care about is always worth the risk. The real ending was the knowledge that we were enough, not because we were perfect, but because we were perfectly, completely, unconditionally ourselves. And that, I realized as I settled into my own bed with a book and a cup of tea, was the only ending that had ever mattered.